There is a particular shot very near the end of The Great Silence that serves as a very neat symbol for the outlook on society that this film has. And it's when Tigrero, played by Klaus Kinski, is riding away from the saloon, having just slaughtered the outlaws in cold blood, all according to the law, as he says. And he's entirely correct. It is indeed all according to the law. And the shot captures his reflection in the window, but through the window, behind his reflection, we can see the dead bodies of his victims hanging as if they're slabs of meat in a butcher's shop. And this nicely symbolises the outlook on Western society that this film has, which is that beneath the veneer, the surface of respectability and tolerance and propriety that the Western world purports to have, lies an exploitative, violent base that in this film at least is transparent, that we can see through that surface, we can see to the brutal realities lying beneath. And this film is a particularly nihilistic and particularly bleak example of quite a dominant trend in the Italian Western in the second half of the 1960s. So if we look at films such as Django Kill, If You Live Shoot, Day of Anger, Sabata, Death Rides a Horse, we can see towns in which the leading citizens, the most respected people, the judges, the sheriffs, the bankers, the landowners, are psychotic megalomaniacs. And The Great Silence is clearly a part of this trend. We can also see films like I Am Sartana, Your Angel of Death, The Big Gun Down, The Price of Power, where we see innocent people being framed for crimes they didn't commit by very powerful power mongers who then hunt them down. And very commonly in these films, we get symbols of law and order, symbols of civilization and propriety being turned around so that they mean something very different. Most specifically, the tin star, the sheriff's badge or the deputy's badge. In many of these films, we get kind of mobs of tin star wearing hoodlums who hunt down innocent people because prices have been put on their heads. And the tin star, of course, is a very potent symbol in Hollywood cinema, in the Hollywood Western. This is a badge that was worn with pride by Henry Fonda in My Darling Clementine and by John Wayne in Rio Bravo. It's also the badge that was discarded and thrown aside with such acerbic commentary on contemporary Hollywood and contemporary America by Gary Cooper in High Noon. And that was reflective of Carl Foreman, the screenwriter of High Noon's disillusionment with the hypocrisy of contemporary America and contemporary Hollywood in the McCarthy era. So given that heritage of the symbol of the tin star, at the moment in The Great Silence, when during Silencio's flashback to his parents being massacred, one of the killers discards a star, takes a star off his costume and discards it as if it means nothing. It was just a ruse to get access to the house. The filmmakers knew what they were doing at this moment. So in this film, symbols of law and order are co-opted as signifiers of murderous greed and avarice, and they denote the worst sins of the most powerful in society, as they do in these other films as well. And The Great Silence fits neatly into this trend in the late 60s, but as I've said, it's the most nihilistic and the bleakest of all of them. Now, the reason The Great Silence is quite so bleak is partly because of the setting. The town of Snow Hill, this blizzard-bitten town, is a nice symbol for the kind of inverted, bleak moral world we find in The Great Silence. And the only scene in the whole film that's not set either in Snow Hill or in the mountains surrounding Snow Hill gives us a clue as to the broader political environment that's led to the corruption we see in the town when we see the state governor talking to Sheriff Burnett. And the state governor agrees that the outlaws should be pardoned, but he does that not because it's the right thing to do. He does it because the electorate believe in the law and he wants their votes. So in other words, he sees them as credulous and he just wants to play to the audience. So there's no innate belief in the goodness of democracy or of the political system. He's just playing the game. And it's made quite clear where real power lies in the barrel of a gun when Sheriff Burnett says jovially to the state governor that he's the fastest drawer in the state and that's why he's so powerful. So In this film, as in so many other Italian westerns, democracy is a sham. It's mere window dressing for murderous brutality. And it's, as I said, a thin veneer here, and we can see beneath the surface. We can see the brutality that underlies Western society in this bleak vision of the Wild West. And in these films, in these late 60s spaghetti westerns, sheriffs tend to be one of two types. They either tend to be people who willfully and gleefully carry out the orders of these megalomaniacs at the top of society, or they are people who exist in a state of false consciousness, who believe naively in the sanctity of the law, that they are protecting the innocent, that they're punishing the guilty, but they're oblivious to the fact that they're mere pawns for the powermongers at the top of society. And Sheriff Burnett belongs in this latter category. He genuinely believes in the sanctity of the law. He shows a naive adherence to a code of honour that protects the innocent and punishes the guilty. But then, of course, when he is eventually killed by Tigrero, Tigrero educates him just before he dispatches him by telling him that he'll die in the ice and Tigrero will get to live to defend the only real law, which is the survival of the fittest. And that, again, is a good symbol for the outlook on society that we see in The Great Silence. If we then look at some of the other characters in this film, we can see where this moral world is being built from and how it's becoming very inverted, so that all the values we might attach to Western tolerance and civilization are turned on their heads. So we get Pollicut, Luigi Pistilli's character, who was one of the killers of Silenzio's parents, who's a brutal criminal, but has now risen to become Justice of the Peace in Snow Hill, and a banker, one of the respected citizens who really dominates the town under an iron fist by putting bounties on people's heads arbitrarily and then setting Tigrero and his bounty hunters on them to guarantee a swift execution. And Pistilli's character, Pollicut, is set in binary opposition to Silenzio. Silenzio, who is very rarely for the Italian Western an unambiguously good hero. He stands for justice, he's trying to avenge his parents, he protects the innocent, he tries to punish the guilty. Many spaghetti western heroes are famously anti-heroes in some way. They are not entirely morally good. But Silenzio is the only beacon of hope in the entire film. Which of course means that the fact that he's fighting against the law, not for it, is all the more important. Because Tigrero is indeed on the side of the law. He is allowed to speak in numerous occasions through this film as if he's a hard-working American trying to make ends meet, all according to the law. And of course his business is the massacre of innocent people. And that is indeed legal in this film, and that nicely illustrates the inverted moral compass of The Great Silence. Now, the fact that Silenzio is so virtuous and so unambiguously a force for good is, of course, the reason why the ending of this film is so shocking. Because we probably don't expect on first viewing that he is indeed going to be gunned down in cold blood and that all of the outlaws are going to be massacred and that Tigrero is going to walk away scot-free. But Corbucci, in later years, when he looked back on this film, gleefully recalled that he outraged audiences so much with this ending that one viewer in Paris was so outraged that he drew a gun and opened fire on the cinema screen. This is impossible to verify. We don't know if this really happened or not. It sounds quite apocryphal. However, it does nicely reveal Corbucci's intentions with this ending. He was trying to outrage audiences. He was trying to shake audiences out of a passive acceptance of genre cliché happy endings. He was trying to do something different with this film. Because The Great Silence was the product of what is known as the filone system of formulae that are being replicated with incremental innovation in the late 1960s into the 70s in Italian cinema, it's inevitable that there are certain parallels with other films, with other Italian westerns, and indeed that is the case with The Great Silence. And we can see a particular precursor to Luigi Pistilli's character Pollicut if we watch Death Rides a Horse, where Pistilli plays Walcott, who, similarly to Pollicut, is somebody who has a very shady, violent past, but has risen to become a figure of authority in the town. And so we can see an echo here of Pistilli's role from the year before in Death Rides a Horse. In turn, The Great Silence was a very influential film after its release, and it had an influence further down the line on other Italian westerns. And there are two in particular that I think are particularly interesting here. The first one is The Specialists. It's Corbucci's own film from the following year, 1969. And in The Specialists, we have another sheriff who is naively believing in the sanctity of the law and who similarly gets killed because of his naive adherence to this, and he allows himself to be caught unarmed, just like Sheriff Burnett in The Great Silence. We also have, in an even more direct parallel, another character called Polycut, who again is a malevolent banker, who again is leeching the town dry and dominating the town. And then we also have a beautiful young lady living on the outskirts of town who gives the hero shelter and helps the hero, in a reference to Pauline in The Great Silence. The other film that shows a very direct influence from The Great Silence is I Am Satana, Your Angel of Death, Giuliano Canameo's film, also from 1969. This film reunites Klaus Kinski and Frank Wolf from The Great Silence, and once again Kinski's diabolical bounty hunter stops a stagecoach and loads bodies onto the roof of the stagecoach in a direct quotation of one of the famous scenes from The Great Silence. And this Satana film is, it's more light-hearted than The Great Silence, but it occupies the same kind of bleak moral universe in that we get innocent people having prices put on their heads so that bands of bounty hunters will hunt them down and kill them, and then they deposit their bodies at the bank in town, and they keep wanted posters as currency, and Sultana is framed for a crime he didn't commit. So there's an equivalently bleak moral universe here across lots of different spaghetti westerns, and The Great Silence plays a part in that. And this, of course, is precisely how Filone cinema operated. It's a balance between convention and invention. You have to adhere to certain formulae, but you innovate as you go along, and certain things remain across different films and certain things are cut out with individual filmmakers introducing their own takes on these formulae. And that's precisely what we see in The Great Silence, and then how it carries forward into other filmmaking in the Italian studio system. In terms of the influence of The Great Silence beyond Italy and outside the Italian film industry, there is certainly a thread of influence, I think, we can see with the countercultural strand of New Hollywood as it took over the Western genre in Hollywood in the early 70s, throughout the 70s. And in particular, if we look at Michael Cimino's lavishly expensive Heaven's Gate from 1980, we can see certain parallels with The Great Silence. In that film, the diabolical rancher Frank Canton declares that the immigrants, who are completely powerless and innocent, are thieves, anarchists and outlaws, echoing almost word for word some of Tigrero's utterances about the outlaws in The Great Silence. There is also a scene where Canton executes a bound immigrant who's just helpless in front of him, and before doing it he declares, "We are the law," which again, a very similar outlook to Tigrero and Polycut and the way they dominate the town of Snow Hill. And Heaven's Gate is similarly full of malevolent law enforcers hunting down the innocent and ultimately triumphing in a final massacre with a very bleak ending and a very bleak outlook on Western society, by which I mean both the Western genre and Occidental capitalism. Now, this isn't necessarily a direct influence, because The Great Silence didn't initially get a cinematic release in the US. It didn't find a distributor. But instead, I think what this shows is that the Western genre from the late 60s onwards was becoming more and more disillusioned. It was registering countercultural sentiment more and more, and the Italians got there very early. And The Great Silence is one of those films that shows how early they did get there, in advance of New Hollywood taking over the Western genre in Hollywood itself.